June 4th, 1943. The golden afternoon light washed over the small village of Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire, nestled among the rolling hills of central France. 12-year-old Isabelle Dufour stood at the edge of the Loire River, skipping stones across its surface, as German military patrols rumbled through the nearby streets. She imagined, like most children in occupied France, that liberation would come dramatically and swiftly, with Allied forces sweeping through her village like avenging angels. Little did she know that her own salvation would arrive not in the form of an army, but a single American pilot whose downed aircraft would change her life forever, setting in motion a story of patience and faith that would span 3 long years of waiting by this very riverbank. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true story of how a chance encounter during the darkest days of the war created an unbreakable bond between two people from different worlds, and how the simplest acts of kindness can echo across years, across continents, and across the boundaries that divide us. The village of Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire had changed dramatically since the occupation began. Once a vibrant community known for its wine production and riverside festivals, it had become a shadow of its former self. Food was scarce, with most local produce being requisitioned for the occupying forces. The population lived under constant surveillance, with a curfew strictly enforced from 8 in the evening until 5 in the morning. Major Wilhelm Schneider, commander of the local German garrison, maintained order with 48 soldiers under his command. A career military officer from Munich with 22 years of service, Schneider ran the occupation with precise efficiency rather than excessive cruelty. He had been specifically instructed to maintain good relations with the local population to minimize resistance activities in the strategically important Loire Valley region. For Isabelle Dufour, daughter of the local doctor, life under occupation had become a series of carefully navigated restrictions. Her father, Dr. Henri Dufour, aged 47, was one of the few villagers who maintained limited freedom of movement due to his medical expertise, which even the occupation forces respected. Her mother, Marguerite, managed their household with remarkable resilience, stretching meager rations and maintaining as much normalcy as possible for Isabelle. Isabelle's daily routine included attending the village school, which operated under strict German oversight, helping her mother with household tasks, and her one true pleasure, her evening walks along the Loire River. These walks were permitted because the river path remained visible from several German observation points, and Dr. Dufour had specifically requested this allowance for his daughter's health. Major Schneider, who occasionally required the doctor's services for his men, had granted this small concession. The summer of 1943 marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The United States 8th Air Force had significantly increased bombing operations over German-occupied territories, particularly targeting industrial centers, railway junctions, and military installations. This escalation brought the war directly over the skies of previously quiet regions like the Loire Valley. Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell, 24, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot with the 365th Fighter Group. Having completed 17 combat missions, Mitchell had earned a reputation as a steady, reliable pilot with outstanding navigation skills. Before the war, he had worked alongside his father in their family carpentry business and had studied engineering for 2 years at the University of Wisconsin. On that fateful June afternoon, Lieutenant Mitchell was returning from an escort mission protecting B-17 bombers, targeting railway facilities near Tours, approximately 70 kilometers from Saint-Étienne. The mission had encountered unexpected resistance, with 26 Luftwaffe fighters engaging the bomber formation. During the ensuing aerial combat, Mitchell's aircraft sustained damage to its cooling system from defensive fire. Technical Sergeant Robert Wilson, the squadron's chief mechanic, would later note in his maintenance report that the P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was particularly vulnerable to cooling system damage. Once coolant was lost, engine failure would typically occur within 12 to 15 minutes, depending on throttle settings and altitude. As Mitchell nursed his failing aircraft back toward Allied lines, The engine temperature continued rising beyond critical levels. Radio operator Staff Sergeant James Donnelly received Mitchell's final transmission at 1637 hours. Thunderbolt 37, engine critical, seeking emergency landing site vicinity of Loire River. Approximate coordinates unknown over. No further transmissions were received from Lieutenant Mitchell's aircraft. Isabelle Dufour was gathering wild strawberries along the riverbank when she heard the distinctive sound of a struggling aircraft engine. Looking up, she saw a fighter plane with American markings flying dangerously low, trailing a plume of dark smoke. The aircraft passed directly overhead, so close that she could see the pilot in the cockpit, his face tense with concentration. The P-47 Thunderbolt continued for another kilometer before disappearing behind a line of trees that marked the boundary of the Fontaine estate, a large vineyard property requisitioned as the local German headquarters. Moments later, Isabelle heard not the expected sound of a crash, but rather a series of mechanical noises, suggesting a controlled landing. Without thinking of the consequences, Isabelle ran in the direction of the aircraft, cutting through a small wooded area that she knew would keep her hidden from the main road. Her heart pounded as she realized that an actual American airman, one of the liberators her parents spoke about in whispers, was here, in her village. Lieutenant Mitchell had managed a remarkable feat of airmanship. With his engine seized completely, he had guided the powerless aircraft to a relatively flat section of vineyard, using the rows of grapevines to slow his landing roll. The aircraft had sustained substantial damage but remained largely intact. More importantly, Mitchell himself had escaped with only minor injuries, a laceration to his forehead and a sprained ankle from the impact. Disoriented and aware of the immediate danger, Mitchell extracted himself from the cockpit and assessed his situation. His emergency map indicated he was deep in occupied territory, at least 300 kilometers from Allied lines or any known resistance networks. Standard protocol demanded he destroy sensitive equipment and documents, then attempt to evade capture and make his way towards Spain or the coast. As he was removing his encryption codebook to destroy it, Mitchell heard a rustling sound from the nearby tree line. Instinctively reaching for his service pistol, he turned to face the potential threat, only to find himself looking at a young French girl with wide eyes and strawberry-stained fingers. Isabelle Dufour later described this moment in a letter to her cousin. He looked like an angel with blood on his face. I was not afraid because his eyes were kind, even though he pointed a gun at me. I said, "America," and he slowly lowered his weapon. That was when I heard the German trucks. Indeed, the German response to the downed aircraft was remarkably swift. Major Schneider had immediately dispatched 2 vehicles with 16 soldiers to secure the site. They were approaching from the main road, less than 500 meters away. What happened next was a moment of pure instinct. Isabelle grabbed Mitchell's hand and pulled him toward a drainage culvert that ran under the vineyard, part of an old irrigation system that she and other local children used as a play area, unknown to the German occupiers who had only been stationed there for 8 months. The culvert was narrow and partially flooded, but it provided a tunnel away from the crash site, eventually opening near the river, almost a kilometer from where the search would be concentrated. Mitchell, despite his injured ankle and the disorientation of his crash, followed the child who was suddenly his only hope of evading capture. Major Schneider personally supervised the recovery operation at the crash site. The aircraft was largely intact, though the engine had been destroyed by overheating. More concerning to him was the absence of the pilot. A thorough search of the immediate area revealed the pilot's helmet and parachute still in the cockpit, indicating he had made a controlled landing and then fled on foot. Schneider immediately ordered expanded search parameters and notified regional headquarters in Orleans. Within an hour, roadblocks were established on all routes leading from Saint-Étienne, and search parties with dogs were being organized. The Major was acutely aware that a downed Allied airman represented both a valuable intelligence resource and a significant security threat if he made contact with local resistance elements. Back at the Dufour household, Dr. Henri Dufour was treating a case of influenza in the mayor's young son when he received word of the downed American aircraft. His first thought was of Isabelle, who he knew would have been near the river at that time. Fighting the urge to rush out immediately to search for her, he maintained his professional composure, completed his treatment, and calmly walked home, aware that any unusual behavior would draw unwanted attention. Upon arriving home, his concern transformed to shock when he found his wife Marguerite, pale with worry, standing watch at their back door. In hushed tones, she explained that Isabel had returned not alone, but with an injured American pilot, whom they had hidden in the root cellar beneath their kitchen. Dr. Dufour's training took over. He gathered medical supplies, carefully checking windows and doors before descending into the cellar. There, lying on a makeshift bed of old blankets, was a young man in an American flight uniform, with Isabel sitting attentively by his side. Lieutenant Mitchell attempted to stand when the doctor entered, military courtesy overriding his exhaustion and injury. Dr. Dufour gently pressed him back down, examining the cut on his forehead and his swollen ankle with professional efficiency. The two men spoke in broken exchanges, Mitchell's high school French combining with Dufour's limited English. The situation was dire. Harboring an enemy combatant carried a potential death sentence for the entire family. Yet Dr. Dufour, who had served as a medical officer in the previous war, felt a professional and moral obligation to the young airman. After treating Mitchell's injuries, the Dufour held a whispered family conference in their kitchen. Marguerite Dufour, despite her terror, was resolute. "We cannot turn him away. If it were our child behind enemy lines, we would pray someone would show the same mercy." The decision was made. They would hide Lieutenant Mitchell until his ankle healed sufficiently for travel, then attempt to connect him with resistance networks that could guide him toward the Spanish border. For Lieutenant Mitchell, the next 7 days were spent in the cramped, damp root cellar, emerging only at night when the blackout curtains were drawn. During these brief periods above ground, he came to know the Dufour family, particularly young Isabel, who appointed herself his personal guardian and French teacher. The German search for the missing pilot continued with systematic thoroughness. Major Schneider had ordered a house-by-house search, but prioritized properties near the crash site and those with known resistance sympathies. The Dufour residence, home to a respected doctor who treated German personnel, was lower on their list and received only a cursory inspection of the main living areas. On June 11th, the situation changed dramatically. Dr. Dufour returned home with grave news. A German patrol had discovered a parachute pack in the woods 3 kilometers away, planted by someone attempting to misdirect the search. Now Major Schneider had ordered a more thorough search of every building in the village, including outbuildings, cellars, and attics. The search would reach their home within 48 hours. That evening, as Isabel helped change the bandage on Mitchell's ankle, she made an unexpected suggestion. The old boathouse. No one ever goes there anymore. The structure in question was a dilapidated stone boathouse on the riverbank, approximately 2 kilometers downstream from the village. Once used for maintaining fishing boats, it had been abandoned years before the war. More importantly, it sat on a property boundary dispute between 2 local landowners, leaving it in a state of administrative limbo that had kept it off official property records. The German occupiers, working from these records for their administration, remained unaware of its existence. Moving Lieutenant Mitchell would be dangerous, but keeping him in the cellar had become impossible. That night, under cover of complete darkness, the American pilot left the relative comfort of the Dufour home. With Dr. Dufour supporting him on one side and Isabel guiding them through fields and wooded areas she knew would avoid German patrols, they made their way to the old boathouse. The structure was simple, a single room with stone walls, a damaged roof, and a wooden dock extending into the river. Inside, they had prepared a hiding space beneath loose floorboards, lined with blankets and stocked with several days of provisions. It was uncomfortable, but offered a better chance of avoiding detection. As dawn approached, Dr. Dufour needed to return home before his absence was noticed. Lieutenant Mitchell grasped his hand in profound gratitude, knowing the risk this family was taking for a stranger. Isabel, however, refused to leave. Only after her father's stern insistence did she reluctantly begin the journey back, turning repeatedly to look at the boathouse until it disappeared from view. The promised German search of the Dufour residence occurred late the following day. 4 soldiers, led by a sergeant, conducted a methodical examination of the property, including the root cellar where Mitchell had been hidden. Finding nothing suspicious, they moved on to the next house, leaving the Dufours in a state of nervous relief. For the next 2 weeks, Lieutenant Mitchell remained hidden in the boathouse. Dr. Dufour visited only twice under the guise of collecting medicinal herbs that grew along the riverbank. Isabel, however, developed an elaborate system for visiting almost daily. She would take her permitted evening walks along the river, always in full view of observation points. Then, during brief moments when patrols changed or attention was directed elsewhere, would dart down to the boathouse for short visits. During these visits, she brought food, clean bandages, and most valuably, information. Isabel had an uncanny ability to gather intelligence about German patrol schedules and movements simply by observing from her innocent vantage points around the village. This information proved crucial as they planned Mitchell's eventual escape. By late June, Mitchell's ankle had healed sufficiently for more extended movement. Dr. Dufour made contact with a resistance network operating in the region, who agreed to guide the American to a safe house in Tours, from where he could be moved along an established escape route toward the Pyrenees and eventually to neutral Spain. The evening of June 27th was set for the handover. A resistance operative would arrive by boat, traveling upriver under cover of darkness, and take Mitchell to the next safe house. The plan was simple but dangerous. German patrols regularly monitored the river, and curfew violations carried severe penalties. On that final evening, Isabel arrived at the boathouse with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a chunk of real chocolate, an almost mythical luxury in occupied France that her mother had saved from before the war for a special occasion. Lieutenant Mitchell was deeply moved by the gift, breaking it in half and insisting Isabel take part. As they shared this simple luxury, Mitchell made a solemn promise. "When the war is over, I will come back. I will find you and thank your family properly for what you've done for me." Isabel, with the directness of youth, extracted a specific promise. "Will you meet me here, right at this spot by the river?" Mitchell, perhaps humoring what he thought was a child's fancy, agreed, "Yes, right here, and we'll skip stones across the water to celebrate." At 2200 hours, the sound of a boat motor broke the night silence. The resistance contact had arrived. With a hurried goodbye and a final handshake with his young savior, Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell disappeared into the darkness, guided by strangers who would risk their lives to deliver him to freedom. 3 days later, the Dufour family received word through the clandestine network that Mitchell had safely reached Tours. 2 weeks after that, a coded message confirmed he had crossed into Spain. For Lieutenant Mitchell, the war's active phase was over. For Isabel Dufour, a different kind of war had just begun, a war against time and doubt, fought with the unwavering faith of childhood. The day after Mitchell's departure, Isabel returned to the boathouse during her evening walk. She spent nearly an hour there, sitting on the dock, looking out over the river. The following day, she returned again, and the next, and the next. Marguerite Dufour noticed her daughter's new routine but said nothing, understanding the profound impact the American's brief presence had made on the child. Dr. Dufour, more practical, gently suggested that the boathouse should be avoided for some time, as it might still be under observation. Isabel agreed to stay away from the structure itself, but insisted on continuing her daily visits to the riverbank nearby. As weeks turned to months, Isabel's daily pilgrimages to the river became a familiar sight in Saint-Étienne. German soldiers on patrol paid her little attention, just a local girl who enjoyed watching the water. Some of the villagers, unaware of her secret, jokingly referred to her as the little fisherman, though she never carried a rod or line. Major Schneider himself once encountered her during his evening constitutional along the riverfront. "You come here every day, I notice," he commented in his accented French. Isabel, looking up at him with the perfect innocence of a child with nothing to hide, replied, "The river is always the same, but always different. My father says watching it is good for developing patience." The major, who had a daughter of similar age back in Germany, nodded appreciatively at this simple wisdom and continued his walk. Summer gave way to autumn, and autumn to the bitter winter of 1943. Snow blanketed the countryside, and the Loire partially froze in some sections. Still, Isabel maintained her vigil, though shortened by the early darkness and intensified cold. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell had been transported from Spain to Gibraltar, then to England, where he rejoined his squadron in October 1943. His escape and evasion report, filed with intelligence officers, detailed his experience, but deliberately obscured the exact location and names of those who had helped him, a standard practice to protect civilians in occupied territories. In a letter to his parents, censored for operational security, he wrote only, "I've met some of the bravest people imaginable here. A family took care of me when I was in trouble, particularly their young daughter, who showed more courage than many grown men I know. When this is all over, I have promises to keep." By the spring of 1944, the war had shifted dramatically. Allied bombing campaigns intensified, and rumors of an impending invasion spread through occupied France. For the people of Saint-Étienne, however, daily life remained an exercise in endurance. June 6, 1944, D-Day, brought renewed hope. News of the Normandy landing spread quickly, even through censored channels. The German garrison in Saint-Étienne was placed on high alert, with increased patrols and restrictions on civilian movement. Isabel's river visits were temporarily curtailed, causing her visible distress until Major Schneider, in one of his final humane gestures before being replaced by a more hardline commander, specifically authorized her continued walks as posing no security threat. As Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches, the occupation forces in the Loire Valley prepared for potential retreat or confrontation. By August, Saint-Étienne had become part of the Germans' secondary defensive line, with new fortifications and an influx of retreating units from northern positions. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. The news electrified the occupied territories that remained under German control. In Saint-Étienne, the occupation forces began destroying documents and preparing for a potential fighting retreat. On September 10th, advance elements of the United States Third Army approached the outskirts of Saint-Étienne. After a brief exchange of fire that resulted in 5 German casualties, the occupying force surrendered. American tanks rolled into the village square at 1500 hours, greeted by jubilant crowds waving hastily made flags and offering hoarded wine. Isabelle Dufour was not among the celebrating villagers. True to her now unbreakable routine, she was sitting by the riverbank watching the water flow eastward. The distant sound of cheering reached her, but she remained in her place, confident that liberation meant her wait might soon be over. Captain Thomas Mitchell, now promoted and assigned to a liaison role with advancing ground forces due to his knowledge of French and his previous experience in the region, was not among the liberating troops. He remained in England, coordinating air support operations for the advancing Allied forces. Life in liberated Saint-Étienne gradually assumed a new normal. The Dufour family's role in hiding an American airman became known, earning them respect and recognition from both their neighbors and the Allied military administration. Dr. Dufour was appointed to a regional medical coordination committee, helping restore healthcare services across the war-ravaged region. Isabelle, now 13, returned to a school no longer constrained by occupation restrictions. Her teachers noted a new seriousness in her approach to studies, particularly her determination to learn English. Yet her daily routine remained unchanged. Regardless of weather or competing activities, she spent time by the river every single day. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the Allied advance pushed the fighting deep into Germany itself. Victory in Europe seemed increasingly certain, though the human cost continued to mount on all sides. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was officially over. In Saint-Étienne, as across France, celebrations erupted spontaneously. The church bells rang for hours, wine cellars were opened, and impromptu parades formed in streets still bearing the scars of occupation. Isabelle participated in the celebrations, but the following day she was back at her riverside vigil. When her mother gently suggested that perhaps now, with the war over, this daily ritual could end, Isabelle replied with absolute certainty, "He promised he would come back to this exact spot. If I am not here, he might think I have forgotten." Thomas Mitchell, now a major, remained in Europe as part of the occupation forces in Germany. His requests for leave to visit the Loire Valley were repeatedly delayed by the enormous logistical challenges of post-war Europe. Roads remained damaged, transportation was prioritized for military necessity, and civilian travel was heavily restricted. In October 1945, Mitchell was finally approved for return to the United States for demobilization. Before departing Europe, he made one final attempt to obtain permission to visit Saint-Étienne, but was informed that his transport ship schedule could not be modified. With great reluctance, he boarded the USS General A.E. Anderson in Southampton, bound for New York. Upon returning to civilian life in Milwaukee, Mitchell immediately wrote a letter to the mayor of Saint-Étienne, inquiring about the Dufour family. The devastated European postal system, overwhelmed by millions attempting to reconnect with lost loved ones, took nearly 4 months to deliver this message. By the time a response arrived, confirming the family's well-being and providing their address, Mitchell had re-established himself in the family carpentry business and enrolled to complete his engineering degree. A correspondence began between Mitchell and Dr. Dufour, with Isabel occasionally adding notes of her own. The letters were friendly but formal, bridging the gap between wartime intensity and peacetime normalcy. Mitchell explained his circumstances and expressed his deep gratitude, promising that when finances and circumstances permitted, he would fulfill his promise to return. Dr. Dufour assured him that his family understood the practical challenges and considered no debt to exist between them. Isabel's notes never mentioned her daily riverside vigil, which continued uninterrupted. By 1946, life in Saint-Étienne had achieved a tenuous recovery. The physical damage of war had largely been repaired, though economic hardships persisted. Dr. Dufour's practice thrived as he treated the numerous health issues arising from years of deprivation. Marguerite had become involved in community reconstruction efforts, helping organize resources for those most affected by the war. Isabel, now 15, had developed into a serious, purposeful young woman. Her academic performance earned her recognition beyond the village, with a scholarship offer from a prestigious school in Paris. To everyone's surprise, she declined, preferring to remain in Saint-Étienne. Only her parents understood her unstated reason. She would not leave the river. In Milwaukee, Thomas Mitchell completed his engineering degree and expanded the family business to include residential construction, capitalizing on the post-war housing boom. His experiences in Europe remained a defining aspect of his life, though he spoke of them rarely and selectively. The photograph of a French riverbank, captured from his P-47's gun camera moments before his engine failed, sat framed on his desk, a daily reminder of an unfulfilled promise. In December 1946, Mitchell married his pre-war sweetheart, Helen Davidson. During their modest reception, he took her aside and shared the full story of his escape from occupied France, including his promise to Isabel. Helen, rather than expressing jealousy or dismissiveness, encouraged him to make good on his word. Promises made to children should be the ones we keep most faithfully. With his new wife's blessing, Mitchell began making concrete plans for a return to France. The practical obstacles remained formidable. International travel was expensive and complicated. His business required his presence, and the devastated European infrastructure made internal travel unpredictable. Still, he set aside money each month toward this purpose, determined that his promise would not remain unfulfilled. In Saint-Étienne, life continued its forward march. The summer of 1947 brought a bountiful harvest, the first truly successful one since before the war. The village celebrated with the revival of traditional festivals, including boat races on the river and a fireworks display on Bastille Day. Isabel, now 16, participated in these events with measured enthusiasm. She had grown into a quiet beauty, drawing attention from young men in the village and beyond, yet she showed little interest in these attentions, preferring the company of books and her own thoughts, and always, there were her daily visits to the river. Dr. Dufour had begun to worry about this persistent behavior. What had begun as a child's touching loyalty was becoming a potential obstacle to his daughter's development. One evening, after she returned from the river, he attempted a gentle intervention. "Isabel, it has been over 3 years," he said carefully. "The American, he has his own life now in his own country. The promise he made, It was a kind gesture, but perhaps not one we should expect to be literally fulfilled. Isabel looked at her father with calm certainty. "Papa, when you treated his wounds, did he seem like a man who makes promises lightly?" Dr. Dufour had to admit that he had not. Mitchell had impressed him as a man of integrity, even in their brief acquaintance. "Then I will continue to wait," Isabel concluded. "Not every day for the rest of my life, perhaps, but until I am certain." By spring 1948, Thomas Mitchell's business had prospered sufficiently to make his planned journey financially feasible. Post-war travel restrictions had eased, and regular civilian transportation to Europe had resumed, though at considerable expense. After arranging for his father and brother-in-law to oversee the business during his absence, he booked passage on the RMS Queen Elizabeth, departing New York on May 12, 1948. Mitchell had written to the Dufours informing them of his planned visit, but transatlantic mail remained unreliable. He had no way of knowing if they had received his letter, or if they would welcome his appearance after so many years. Nevertheless, he felt compelled to honor his word, regardless of the reception that might await him. The ocean crossing took 5 days, followed by a train journey from Cherbourg to Paris that was delayed repeatedly by ongoing repairs to the rail network. From Paris, Mitchell traveled by a combination of regional trains and buses, each leg of the journey presenting its own complications and delays. On June 2, 1948, almost exactly 5 years since his crash landing, Mitchell arrived in Tours. The final 40 kilometers to Saint-Étienne would have to be traveled by hired car, as the local train service had not yet been restored. In Saint-Étienne, the Dufour family had indeed received Mitchell's letter, just 3 days before his expected arrival. The household was thrown into a flurry of preparation, with Marguerite insisting that their best linens be brought out and a proper celebration planned. Dr. Dufour contacted the mayor, who proposed a small official welcome for the American who had been hidden by villagers. Now a story of local pride. Isabel, upon hearing the news, showed little outward reaction. She continued her normal activities, including her daily river visit. Only her mother noticed that she spent longer than usual brushing her hair that evening and had laid out her newest dress for the following day. June 3rd arrived with perfect early summer weather. The small delegation gathered in the village square, the mayor with his ceremonial sash, Dr. Dufour looking uncomfortable in his formal suit, Marguerite nervously adjusting flower arrangements, and several villagers who remembered the American or had been part of the resistance network. Isabel was not among them. The hired car from Tours was scheduled to arrive at 11 in the morning. 11 came and went with no sign of the vehicle. By noon, Dr. Dufour was visibly concerned, wondering if there had been a misunderstanding or a problem with transportation. The mayor maintained the gathering, assuring everyone that delays were still common in post-war travel. At 1310 hours, the sound of an approaching automobile drew everyone's attention. A black Citroën appeared at the edge of the square, moving slowly over the still damaged cobblestones. It came to a stop and a tall figure emerged, Thomas Mitchell, now 29 years old, dressed in a civilian suit, but carrying himself with military bearing. The small crowd applauded as the mayor stepped forward with a formal greeting. Mitchell, visibly moved by the reception, shook hands and exchanged words of appreciation. His French had improved through deliberate study, allowing him to communicate with reasonable fluency. After several minutes of greetings and introductions, Mitchell turned to Dr. Dufour with a question that had been uppermost in his mind. "And Isabel, how is she?" Before the doctor could respond, Marguerite interjected with a knowing smile. "She is where she has been every day for the past 5 years, Monsieur Mitchell, by the river." Understanding immediately, Mitchell excused himself from the gathering. Despite offers to accompany him, he insisted on going alone, remembering the way perfectly from his time in hiding. The assembled villagers watched as he walked purposefully toward the path that led to the Loire. Isabel sat on a large flat rock that protruded slightly into the water, the same spot where she had spent part of every day since that summer of 1943. Now 17, she had grown from a child into a young woman, her dark hair longer, her face having lost its childish roundness. She wore a simple blue dress and was reading a book, though her eyes frequently lifted to scan the river's surface. Mitchell approached quietly along the path, suddenly uncertain of what he would say after all this time. The weight of this young woman's extraordinary faithfulness, maintaining a daily vigil for 5 years, humbled him profoundly. What could possibly justify such devotion? When he was about 20 meters away, Isabel sensed his presence and looked up. For a long moment neither spoke nor moved. Then, setting her book aside, she stood smoothly and faced him, a smile of absolute vindication illuminating her features. "You are late, Lieutenant Mitchell," she said in carefully practiced English. Mitchell laughed, the tension broken by her perfect, unexpected humor. "It's Major Mitchell now," he corrected gently, closing the distance between them. "And I believe I owe you a proper thank you for saving my life." Isabel shook her head. "You owe me nothing except what you promised, to return to this spot." Mitchell reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, flat stone, not from the Loire, but from the Milwaukee River, thousands of miles away. He had carried it across an ocean specifically for this moment. "I believe, Kit," he said, "I also promised we would skip stones to celebrate." Together, they took turns sending stones dancing across the surface of the Loire River, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 skips, before disappearing beneath the current. With each successful throw, they exchanged stories of the intervening years. Mitchell's return to America, his marriage, his business, Isabel's experiences during liberation, her education, her plans to study medicine like her father. As the afternoon light began to soften, Mitchell finally asked the question that had puzzled him throughout his journey. "Why did you continue coming here every day for 5 years? You must have had doubts I would return." Isabel considered this for a moment before answering. "At first, it was a child's belief in promises. Later, it became something more important, proof that some things remain constant, even when the world is falling apart. Every day I came here was a day I chose to believe that good people keep their word, that patience is rewarded, that faith matters." She picked up another stone, tested its weight in her palm. "And now that you have come, I know these things are true." The story of Major Thomas Mitchell's return to Saint-Étienne soon expanded beyond the village. A photographer from a regional newspaper captured the moment when Mitchell and the Dufour family were honored at a special dinner held by the mayor. The accompanying article, titled "Promise Kept, American Airman Returns," was subsequently picked up by wire services and appeared in several American newspapers. Mitchell remained in Saint-Étienne for 10 days, spending time with the Dufours and other villagers who had been involved in the resistance network. He visited the site where his P-47 had crash-landed, now returned to productive vineyards with no visible evidence of that dramatic event. He sat for hours in the Dufour kitchen, exchanging stories and strengthening a bond that had begun in desperate circumstances. Before departing, Mitchell established a scholarship fund for village children, with Isabel named as its first recipient. The funds would support her medical studies in Paris, which she would begin that autumn. In a private moment before his departure, he asked her if she would continue her daily visits to the river once he was gone. Isabel smiled and shook her head. "The waiting is over," she said simply. "Now it is time to move forward." 32 years later, in 1980, Dr. Isabelle Dufour, by then a respected pediatrician in Lyon, received a letter informing her of Thomas Mitchell's passing after a brief illness. Among his personal effects was a small box containing a smooth stone from the Loire River and a faded photograph of a young girl sitting by flowing water, waiting faithfully for a promise to be kept. In her eulogy, sent to be read at his funeral in Milwaukee, Dr. Dufour wrote, "There are moments that define us, choices that reveal our true character." In the darkest days of war, Thomas Mitchell showed kindness to a child and kept a promise that many would have forgotten. In doing so, he taught me the most important lesson of my life, that integrity is not measured by grand gestures, but by the small promises we keep, even when, especially when, keeping them is difficult. Today, in the small museum in Saint-Étienne-sur-Loire, dedicated to the village's wartime experience, visitors can see a display containing Lieutenant Mitchell's pilot wings, donated by his family, alongside a simple river stone and a handwritten note from Isabelle Dufour that reads, "Faith rewarded, June 3rd, 1948. The story of the French girl and the American pilot has been told and retold, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified. But at its heart remains a truth about human connection that transcends war and time. That sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not found on battlefields, but in the quiet determination to remember, to wait, and to believe in promises made. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.